As the legislature headed into what many expected would be the final week of this year's session, several major bills were still hanging in the balance or awaiting complete passage by both the House of Representatives and the state Senate. Paid family leave, a minimum wage bill, and a 24-hour waiting period for handgun purchases were among them. But there were others. Legislation on the transportation budget, as well as the overall state budget, often referred to as the Big Bill, were among them. And there were others, like finding funding sources for the cleanup of the state's waterways, as well as making headway on long-term financing for state educators' pensions that were lurking in the not-too-distant background. As the session draws to its expected close, we had a chance to speak with local legislators, as well as with Governor Phil Scott, on their thoughts and reflections on the session.
I think there's been a different tone. I tried to set the tone during the budget address, as well as during the State of the State address, that we could take a different approach than what we're seeing in Washington, try to work towards common goals and listen to one another. And I think we've accomplished that. And from my perspective, our secretaries, commissioners have been well received in the committees. It doesn't mean that we always agree on every issue. Obviously we don't, but at least we're listening to one another, which I think is a step in the right direction. There are three bills that are must pass, maybe a fourth one, but we need a budget, we need a transportation bill, we need a capital bill, and we need some sort of revenue bill if there are additional fees and taxes and so forth to pay for what we're spending. So I would say that those are the three important ones, and we have to prioritize. Obviously, some of those other issues are getting a lot of attention, whether it be minimum wage or paid family leave and in the pot bill. As you recall, last year I vetoed the minimum wage bill and the paid family leave bill, and promised to come back in some respects, especially with the family leave, with a voluntary approach, which I think makes a lot of sense. I think it's making more sense every day. So we're still trying to make our case for that. I feel the same way about the minimum wage as I did last year, but again, they're moving in the right direction, trying to alleviate some of my concerns. But I worry about the rural areas of the state. I worry about the small businesses who might be impacted by this, and the unintended consequences of artificially raising wages, when there's another approach. The other approach is, how about we make Vermont more affordable? How about we allow people to keep more of what they earn? And I think that's the common goal. I think we both want the same thing. They have a different approach on how to get there. They'd like to raise wages in order to provide people with more money in their pocket. And I'm saying, let's reduce the cost of living and not keep burdening Vermonters and allowing them to keep more money in their pockets. So again, I look for common goals, and that's one of them.
One piece of legislation where the House and Senate couldn't find common ground was on a bill that would have taxed and regulated the sale of marijuana in Vermont. This was a keen disappointment for Senator Dick Sears, who had supported the measure for several years. Failure of the legislators to agree on a reliable roadside impairment test, one of the conditions laid down by the governor before he would sign it, was one factor in the outcome.
Well, generally it's been fairly positive. There's been, as there is every year, some major disappointments, and one of those is the fact that the House is refusing to deal with the tax and regulate bill after having it for over 2 months to look at it. We passed bills over the last 4 years, at least 5 bills to tax and regulate marijuana, and you begin to wonder, when will there be enough time for them to deal with it, or they just don't want to deal with it.
Why did it fail this time around? What's the big...
Well, I think the House itself is, the Speaker and the leadership seem to get bogged down in the minimum wage and the family leave bill, and they've spent most of their energy on that and then a few other bills, and everything else got left by the wayside, unfortunately. And part of it is that, in defense of the House, they have 2/3 of the body is either new or in their second term, and so that's really difficult. There's not a lot of institutional history there. But by the same token, I don't excuse that.
Members of the House and Senate struggled to come up with language and terms on several bills, like paid family leave and the minimum wage increase. There was also some division over another issue, testing for the presence of lead particles in drinking water at schools and other educational facilities. We sat in on one conference committee on testing for the presence of lead particles of drinking water in schools. This conference committee included local state representative Kathleen James, who also spoke to us later about her thoughts and reflections on the session that was drawing to a close.
Believe it or not, with only a couple days left to go, there's still a lot of bills that we need to get over the finish line. But in general, my first session has been a really fantastic experience. I've been, as you know, appointed to the Education Committee, and so I've really been trying to dive into the issues there, learn as much as I can. I have been appointed to a conference committee, which is working on S40. That's the bill that's going to allow, or I guess require, Vermont schools and child care facilities to test their drinking water for lead and then remediate, replace the taps, basically. So to have worked on such an important bill all session and then have a chance to serve on the conference committee has been a really fantastic experience for a freshman, and we're hoping to come to a conclusion and a compromise on that bill today. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. In many ways, minimum wage has been a real legislative journey for me. I had said many times during the campaign that I supported strongly raising the minimum wage, but I was concerned about the impact it would have on the North Shire small businesses on Main Street. So I've had the opportunity to see how you can work quietly and I hope effectively behind the scenes with other legislators on compromise. So the bill that's coming to the House floor today does reflect a compromise between members of my caucus who had wanted the minimum wage to rise more quickly and members who had wanted it to rise more slowly. And I think that we'll vote out today a compromise bill. Now, what happens, and I'll be proud and happy to vote for that bill. What happens to it in conference committee and whether we can get it signed by the governor that'll be beyond my control at that point. But it's been a really great lesson for me to learn how to advocate for my constituents on both sides of a bill and come up with something that I'm happy to support. Paid family leave, I did vote for the Democratic House version of the bill. I do prefer the kind of all-in approach that the Democratic caucus has been promoting. That bill is hung up in the Senate right now, and I really hope we get some kind of version of it across the finish line because I think it's an important bill for working Vermonters.
Action was still pending on several major bills while we were there, and some faced the possibility of a veto by the governor.
So I think we're actually at the same stage we were last year. We have the same bills that we had controversial issues with last year coming back this year. So we're still with minimum wage, paid family leave, tax and regulate is now on hold, but will probably resurface again next year with some other points put in, some taken out, hopefully a better tax structure placed in that. But once again, the medical monitoring bill is also up for grabs. I have an amendment with Representative Donahue that we think will help fix the legal language. We've worked closely with the judiciary to get the medical monitoring bill more appropriate and more legally structured to make it pass this round, and I think it will pass. I don't know what the governor will do, but once again, I think we have more controversy between the committees in the Senate and the House than we do with the administration. I think the administration is just on pause until the bills actually go over. But we are back at the same point we were last year with the same bills. Paid family leave, minimum wage are still the big, will they pass or won't they pass?
Do you see any potential logjam around bills like the budget or transportation bills or any of those creating tension between the legislative and executive branches?
I don't think that those bills are actually the controversial bills this round. There may be money that people want because we're back in the same spot. There'll be more money this round and they'll be up for grabs, so everybody wants it to go to their favorite project. But I don't think that the budget itself will be where the veto comes in.
Well, I think it's been very interesting, very frustrating, and in some ways productive because we've been discussing matters that are very important to Vermonters. One of the bills that's in the final stages of its process is the lead testing bill for testing the lead in water in schools, and it's in a conference committee to work out differences, but I'm sure it will pass in some form. We have provisions in the budget and then a transportation bill about trying to provide more electric vehicle charging stations, because one of the barriers to people switching to electrical vehicles is being sure that when you're on the road you have access to a charging station, and I think that's a really important step. We are working on important aspects of the economy, the question of how to do paid family leave, the question of whether the minimum wage should increase or not, the question of taxing and regulating marijuana. Some of those bills may not finish their passage this year, but particularly with the cannabis issue, it's really important to set up a structure of regulation that is going to work well, that's fully thought out, because after you put it in place, it isn't easy to change it. Once the industry gets up and running, they will be lobbying for changes that they want that may not be necessarily in the interest of the public. So it's my understanding that bill is going to be carried over until next year. It's important for people to understand that the legislative session, this is just the first year of what's called a biennium. It's a 2-year session. We get elected for 2 years. So bills that don't make it all the way through the process this year still have a chance to go through it next year, but then at the end of next year is going to be major crunch time. Another bill that people might be interested in is a medical monitoring bill, which has to do with dealing with the kind of thing that happened with PFOA in Bennington and trying to be sure that if people are injured by exposure to toxic chemicals due to a company's carelessness, that they will be able to get medical monitoring in case they should develop a disease, and that's moving through the House right now.
So I feel the Senate, it's been a really good, strong session for the Senate. As I think you've probably followed, we passed out the minimum wage bill early on. We passed out a very important lead bill early on, which is still being held up by the House in a committee of conference. This was requiring testing of lead in schools and drinking water. And we sent it to the House February 14th, basically saying that an acceptable amount of lead in water would be 3 parts per billion, although the American Academy of Pediatrics says really no lead in water is acceptable. We, statistically, it looked like 3 was an okay area to be. The House returned it to us, increasing the amount of lead in the water. And that, I think, still surprises a lot of us, why the House would put children and others in greater harm by exposing them to greater lead levels. So they increased it to 5. I know some people had a bill increasing it to 15, but the Senate has stuck with its 3 parts per billion, and right now that's in a committee of conference. The other thing that left the Senate early on, which the House has sent back to us with, I think, some solid changes, and that's the single-use plastic bag bill, S-113, that I and others were involved in and sponsored in the Senate. That will eliminate single-use plastic bags to be used at the point of sale. It puts a fee on paper bags. It also is straws upon request. Really what we've recognized, I think most of the United States and the world has recognized, the plastic is a terrible polluter, but plastic also uses an awful lot of fossil fuel in terms of its development. So it's a good climate bill, it's a good pollution bill. I'm hoping we lead with the signed bill from the governor. As you mentioned, yes, Senate Finance has been in the thick of a broadband bill. We are trying to give greater access, to expand broadband access as much as possible throughout the state. We're working hard on that bill. We passed it out of Senate Finance yesterday. We also put some language in there that looks at groups like your group, that's very important to all of us, cable access. How are we going to continue to maintain what we have in this state if the federal government takes swipes at that kind of funding? And so that's going to be an important study that's going to meet over the summer and look at those kinds of issues. Right now on the House floor is a bill that Senator Sears and I sponsored, S-37. Be very interested in seeing what the votes are like coming out of Bennington County. This is in response to the PFOA contamination. This basically is around who is liable when somebody is harmed by a toxic chemical. Is it the person that was harmed, the victim? Should it be the taxpayer, or should it be the person that used or manufactured? And we believe firmly it should be the person who used it or asked an employee to use it, or the manufacturer. And that's going to be a big vote up there today. I think the House is also dealing with our minimum wage bill today. So I feel like the Senate's gotten a lot done. You'll see in the transportation bill a lot of things having to do with working to mitigate climate change. Tough for a small state to play a role in this, but we have to play a role in it. We want to play a role in it. And by tough, I mean, I think we all recognize that Vermont alone is not going to help mitigate really climate change issues, but we can start to build resiliency. We can, without a doubt, play a role in showing people how to take important steps that hopefully larger states and perhaps the federal government, which, as you know, has abandoned any kind of progress on this issue. So I feel that overall it's been a good session, but also looking forward to getting back to Bennington County.
It ain't over till it's over, a wise man once said, so there may be more to come, or not. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.